Okay, hello everybody. Just give me 1 second to, unfortunately, very abruptly cut the music. 1 sec. There we go. So, yeah, apologies, we don't have the ability to fade that out, so it's a hard cut, I'm afraid. Thank you for joining, and welcome to Accessing Your Apple Estate Remotely, which, just to prep you, is going to be an extremely nerdy session, so I hope you're all prepared for that. Just a couple of quick notes for some housekeeping. I think a couple of you have already seen the chat. There's a Q&A feature in the chat, so if you want to ask us a question, if you look at where it says type your comment, there's a little bubble to the top right of that box that means you can flick to Q&A mode. That means when you ask a question, it will be marked with a red Q. And that just lets us know that we need to pay attention to that when we come to the Q&A section a bit later. Don't worry if you forget to use it. We have Jeremy from our marketing team moderating the chat, so he'll be able to mark it as a question for you if you forget to do it yourself. So any question you want to ask, please make sure it has a red Q next to it one way or the other. So that is that out of the way. I'm James Dancer. I'm Group Technical Director for the Academia Group, as well as for Atama. And with me, I have Martin Dorschler, the Apple Solutions Manager for Academia and Atama as well, who hopefully is going to turn his camera on. Hello, Martin.
Hello, James.
Yeah, excellent. I can hear you, so hopefully everybody else can hear us as well. Please.
And I haven't heard silence for the last 3 minutes, so hopefully they can all hear you too.
Well, there we go. Good. So we're going to cover a couple of different topics today. First one is going to be remote desktop access for users, which is a product called NoMachine, and already looks like we have a question in for that already without even starting. So it's going to be a fun session. That's with me, and then Martin is going to cover remote SSH and VNC access for admins via zero tier. So you might not have heard of zero tier before, but Martin will give you a good rundown of what that is and what it does. So that's kind of for the other way around, for you to access machines that are outside your network for admin purposes and things. So that's basically it from an intro perspective. Martin, if you want to turn your video off, you're more than welcome while I'm doing this bit. And then I will do exactly the same when you're
get out of your way.
Thank you very much. So on to NoMachine. Just to give you an idea of what it is, if you haven't heard of it before, it's comprised of 3 different components. So there is what they call a server app, which is product name is NoMachine Enterprise Desktop. That sits on your endpoint machines that are the targets for being remoted into. There's a bit of some fun terminology with NoMachine, so I've got a couple of pointers about what the terminology means all the way through this. But if you don't understand anything, please feel free to ask in chat. And this is also being recorded, so you can always go back and watch the re-record as well. There is also a broker server. A product name for that is NoMachine Cloud Server. That gives users the ability to go to one central place to then access the desktops that are inside your environment. And then there's a client app or multiple client apps. One is a web-based app, so NoMachine works absolutely fine and actually really well through a web browser. Needs to be HTML5 capable though. NoMachine Desktop, which you'd imagine is a desktop app, funnily enough, and that is available for macOS, Windows, and Linux for the client side when you're connecting to a remote machine. And NoMachine also has iOS and Android apps. Not entirely sure if you would want to connect to a remote Mac desktop from your iPhone or your Android phone, but it is absolutely possible. And it does actually work really, really well on tablets. So those are the sort of the main components that we'll go through and discuss. I may go a bit quickly here because there's quite a lot of content to get through. But again, if you've got questions or something isn't particularly clear, please feel free to throw that in chat, and we'll attempt to make it as easy to understand as it's humanly possible. So to give you an idea about how this all works in an environment, this is our best attempt at simplifying the NoMachine architecture. So if you look on the right-hand side, you have your on-premise devices. Those are the ones in your LAN that are usually attended by users when we're not in the fun situation we're in at the moment. And those are the ones that have the NoMachine Enterprise Desktop app on. So they don't just have to be Apple devices, by the way. You can also run this on a Windows estate and a Linux estate. And for Linux as well, there is the option to use a Linux device as a terminal server, so you can have multiple user sessions on the same box, but we're focusing on Apple today, so everything is kind of Apple based, if you like. Those all connect to the NoMachine Cloud Server, which will need to sit in a DMZ because users need to get access to it from outside your network. That can either be a virtual machine, It doesn't care about the hypervisor particularly it's on, or it can be bare metal, and it will work on again pretty much any operating system. So Cloud Server can be installed on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, although you probably wouldn't want to put it on Mac OS because there's sort of no high availability and disaster recovery and stuff on the basis you can't virtualize Mac OS. I know you can technically before anybody tries to call me out, but the EULA prevents you from doing so. Yeah, EULAs. So the other thing about Cloud Server is that it can be clustered. It can be made highly available. There's a bit of additional infrastructure that needs to be put in place for that. So I'm not going to cover that today, but we can send you a bit more information on that if it's something of interest. Obviously, if something's in your DMZ, there's a firewall sitting in front of it and the firewall's connected to the WAN. But then from a remote device perspective, as I said previously, you've got a desktop client app, tablet apps or mobile apps, and web browser-based apps. So a question we've already been asked previously is, does this work on Chromebooks? It does work on Chromebooks. So even if you've got Chromebooks out there in the wide world with your users, they can still connect to a high-powered Mac desktop from a Chromebook, which is actually kind of cool. So in terms of user integration, you can integrate it with Active Directory or basically any other LDAP. So I'm not sure if anybody would be using any LDAP that isn't Active Directory based, but you can do that. There is a pretty strict rule, though, is that users must be accessible to the cloud server and the desktop machines that you're using as targets. So from an Active Directory or an LDAP perspective, that's quite easy. If your end user compute devices, your target devices, your Macs that are sitting in labs or on your LAN are connected to Active Directory, you just need to make sure that the cloud server that you are using can also see those users via LDAP or Active Directory. So if you've installed Cloud Server on Linux, then you can use something like Winbind for that, or if it's installed on Windows, then that just needs to be bound to the domain and the users need to be accessible from that OS. The reason for that is when a user logs into the Cloud Server UI, they will log in with their directory-based account, and it needs to be able to forward those account details to the target device as well. If the passwords are the same, then it's a seamless experience. There is the potential, and there's maybe a couple of use cases for this, that you don't have to have the same password for the user account that is accessible to Cloud Server and the target devices respectively. I don't know why you would do that. So potentially it could be if your Cloud Server or your DMZ, for whatever reason, can't see Active Directory or your LDAP, but Martin's got a way to work around that, as we'll find out later, via using zero tier. But if you don't have the same password for your user accounts on Cloud Server as well as the target devices, then it will ask the user to authenticate with their password before they can hit the desktop again. So they log into Cloud Server with one password, they log into the desktop with another. I don't know why you would do that, but it is entirely possible. So I just thought I'd mention that. Fundamentally, the user account needs to be on both of those systems, though. And the other thing to bear in mind from a user perspective, desktop nodes, and I'll get into what a node is a bit later, that is, again, your target device, can be a pooled resource. So a user doesn't have to see every single device that is available on the network to them. What they can see is effectively a group of different devices. So if you're using a specific group of Macs for audio use, they would see one icon that says audio. They might see another one for video or graphics or development and programming or something like that. And then No Machine will use a broker system to pick the available machine that that user will be sent to. So that's quite a cool feature, because you probably don't really want every user to have every machine available, because they won't know which machine is available and you might get clashed sessions and things like that. So that's just something to bear in mind. Before I go into config files, I could go into an awful lot of depth with this. So one thing I want to extend to everybody is, if after this, because this is quite a whirlwind high-level tour, you want a bit more of an in-depth one as like a workflow or a walkthrough to set everything up, we can look at putting one of those on as well. It's not scheduled, but we're happy to do it if there's enough interest. So there's not a lot to show you from a UI perspective, because pretty much everything in No Machine is configured via config files. So I'm sure everybody's used to working with them. Don't worry, they're not particularly scary. They're actually very descriptive. But there's not a lot of clicky pointy UI stuff. There is some stuff in the roadmap to add some of the config file functionality to the UI, but it's effectively text-based config files right now. So in terms of the terminology in the config files, When I'm talking about a node, that's referring to the machine that will be used as a remote target. So that is those devices that are inside your network that you want to be accessible from outside your network. And the server, when I talk about server, that is not No Machine Cloud Server. That is the server process that sits on the nodes to provide a remote desktop. So this is why I'm saying terminology takes a little bit to get your head around. So in this context, when I'm talking config files, node is the actual machine and server is the process that provides a remote desktop. That uses a thing called the NX protocol, which, just for avoidance of doubt, is its own remote desktop protocol. So it doesn't use X desktop. It actually, the acronym comes from, it was originally called No More X. So it's its own proprietary thing, which is quite good. I say quite good. It's very good for things like audio and video use, because audio and video sync was one of the main reasons that No Machine thought to develop a new protocol rather than use something like VNC or X desktop, which, as we know, doesn't handle audio or video very well. So server config. The server config file, I'm going to read this just verbatim because it's easy to describe. It rules the general behavior of the server. So it defines things like enabling and disabling requesting local confirmation before being required to remotely connect. So obviously what you don't want in a remote environment is when a user tries to connect to a node or a target device, the prompt comes up on the screen saying, do you want this user to connect? So you can disable that. You can also allow or forbid users to connect using an account with administrative privileges. You might have another mechanism for administering your estate, one potentially that Martin will talk about in a bit. That means you, for security reasons, you just want to disable any potential admin account-based access via No Machine, which is, my recommendation would be that's your default setting. You can also determine a load balancing algorithm to be used in a multi-node environment. So that's not so relevant to macOS, but it's more things like in a multi-user session, how many users do you want to allow onto a target node before new users are pushed to a different one? And while that might be technically possible with macOS, it does violate the EULA. So I am sad enough to have read the whole of the macOS EULA and most of the other Apple EULAs. But effectively, while you can connect multiple users and multiple sessions remotely to macOS, the license only grants you the ability for one user to be able to interact with the OS. All other users have to be sort of a watch or a read only. So just wanted to make that clear. And also something everybody should do in this scenario is things like enabling and blanking the local screen when a remote session is active. So you obviously don't want everything a user is doing to be visible to anybody who might be walking past the machine. So you can do things like that as well. There's actually lots more than you can do with that, but these are sort of the most common things that you would configure in server.config. So that is that. And the general disclaimer here at the bottom is settings in server.config applies to all users and are overridden by profile rules when set, because it governs the server process that provides the remote desktop on the target node device. And that was a really long sentence. So moving on to node.config. That allows you to configure behaviors specific for the host where it's installed. So that's the behavior of that machine as opposed to the remote desktop process. So things like enabling and disabling services such as sharing devices, printers, and file transfer. So with No Machine, you can forward and share USB devices. How good that is depends entirely on your network environment, what's allowed, what's not allowed, quality of service, the internet weather in between that and the user's internet connection, so that your mileage may vary with that. But things like file transfer, you may want to allow or deny file transfer between the client device and the target device. You can also hide the No Machine icon in the system tray from node.config. So if you don't want the users to be able to access the No Machine settings, which you probably don't, then you want to hide the No Machine icon from the system tray so they can't get into the application. And you can also enable and disable server preferences because Node sits outside server.config. So things like if the user somehow manages to get through to the No Machine app, can they see all of the other devices automatically that are on the LAN? You probably want to disable that as well. So one of the most useful things that you probably want to do as well is things like setting an inactivity timeout for login. So if a user has basically logged into a remote machine and has walked away or gone to sleep or whatever, you can set an inactivity timeout in seconds to just basically boot them out if they haven't done anything. So these are the sort of the most common things we get asked about. Can you do this with No Machine? The answer to all of those is obviously yes. The description on this is settings in the node.config file applies to all users accessing the host and are strictly dependent on the host environment, which is one of those, as I said, the distinctions between what server.config does and what node.config does. So some examples of config files, and these are, I was thinking about sharing my screen with something like Sublime Text and showing you the config files themselves, but there is so much in there. I just thought I would give you an idea of the structure. So these are literally copy pastas straight out of each of those different config files. And as you can see, they're very descriptive. So things like blanking the physical screen of the machine when somebody connects, it gives you both of the options and what those options are in plain English with a full description. So the config files for No Machine are not scary at all. They're not just a bunch of parameters with enable or disable. They are extremely descriptive like this. Obviously, for anybody who's going to notice this, and I'm sure there'll be a few, the descriptions would normally be hashed out in the config file. I've just removed them purely for the purpose of a presentation because it looks messy otherwise. But I've left it in for the actual setting itself, which is enable screen blanking is 1, which means, as you probably gathered, screen blanking is set to enabled in that particular part of the config file. In node.config, there is a bit more extensibility. So while there are options like in server.config, and a lot of them, you also have the ability to put standard arguments in as well. So as you can see for this one, for display server extra options, you can specify a number of different options and operators for that specific function. So what I've set for this one is timeout 300, which means there will be an inactivity timeout on that machine of 300 seconds for any user that remains inactive for that amount of time. So hopefully I haven't whizzed through those too quickly. Again, as I said, this is recorded if you want to have a look at it back. But those are the main ways that you would configure No Machine from a back-end perspective. What I wanted to show you is what it looks like from a user UI perspective. And for a couple of reasons, this is not a live demo. One of the reasons is I'm a giant chicken. The other reasons are that for this particular setup, due to the current wonderful environment and the fact that our lab environment at work is currently under maintenance, I've had to build this for this webinar in my own personal lab environment, which is actually based in Hetzner in Germany. So to do this demo, I was my client machine was a web browser on a Windows device, which was connecting to a cloud server that is sitting in Hetzner in Germany, which was then providing a desktop from the MacBook Pro that is sitting on the same desk as the Windows machine that I was connecting to it from. So there's a bit of round tripping going on. And my reason for not wanting to do this live is that basically I'm a Virgin Media customer and I don't know what's going to happen if I try that live. So I picked a night where it's nice and quiet and good routes, low ping, and I ran a live recording of it. So I'm just going to give you an idea of what this looks like. So I'll hop over to a video really quickly. So web UI looks like this, pretty straightforward. Type in a username, type in a password, hit go, and you pick the device that you want to connect to. That device could be a node or it could be a group of nodes. It would look exactly the same. And then you connect to the desktop. You'll notice a tick right here. That's the resolution automatically adjusting to fit the web browser. Same thing in the desktop app. And I'll just add a couple of clicks just to give you an idea of what kind of response you can expect. Now, bear in mind, again, this was from a cloud server in Germany, so there was a lot of routing going on that wasn't local for this to happen. You probably noticed, and I'll just do this very quickly. I want to run that again. And if I go like that, you'll notice there's a little bit of flickering on the transparent menu. Now, that's not necessarily a No Machine thing. That's a remote protocol UI thing in pretty much every remote desktop piece of software I've used. Transparency isn't particularly great, but that doesn't affect things like audio and video sync and doesn't affect any of the rest of the usability. And it actually sort of picks up after the first transparent movement has happened. So to be honest, there's not much more to show from a UI perspective than that, because that is the user experience right there. That's you go to either a desktop app or a web UI, type in a username and password, you click on an icon, and that happens, and you're in a desktop. It really doesn't get much easier than that. And the experience in a web browser is actually pretty close to what you get in the desktop app. Desktop app's a little bit better and a little bit more efficient because there's not a web browser and HTML5 in the middle, but it's absolutely perfectly acceptable to use a browser if you have no other options. So let me just jump back into the presentation, and there we go. And that's pretty much it from No Machine perspective. I know that was a very, very quick whirlwind tour, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions. Feel free to throw them into the chat. I'm going to hand over to Martin in a second for the zero tier side. Again, if you do want a more in-depth look at either of these elements that we're looking at, please let us know, and we'll look at doing other sessions. So Martin, I'm guessing and hoping that a delivery hasn't happened and your dog isn't barking at the moment. Are you all right to go?
I am. In fact, the delivery has happened while you were talking, so
okay.
That is all dealt with, and I'm not expecting any other interruptions.
Wonderful. A little bit of audio lag, but I'm sure that will pick up in a second. So I'm going to come back for the Q&A, everybody. I'll turn my camera off for the moment and leave you in the very capable hands of Martin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Okay, zero tier. So we've listed this as accessing your Apple estate remotely, and this section as being adminning your remote estate with zero tier. So let's start with what is zero tier. So zero tier is a software network, or a software described network. Essentially, it is a virtual network that can be set to be private or public. So a virtual network that can be private sounds a lot like a VPN. Well, in essence, it is, although VPN means something very specific to all of us. However, it does share a lot of similarities. We're using that in order to be able to use common tools that we use inside our network for adminning our Macs, no matter where the estate is. And I'm going to run through what we need for that, and then I'm going to have a demo of how quick and easy that is to set up. So what we need to set this up is a router or server, although a much better term would be aggregator. None of the traffic is actually going to travel through this. It merely defines what the network is and who is a member of that network. And then we need a client app on our clients. For the Macs, this will just be a package that we push down. So the client app will push out as a package, and I'll show you that in a minute. And the router server we set up to describe our network. Is it secure? In my opinion, it's very secure. It is all end-to-end certificate-based encryption. You can see there on the screen, it's 256-bit, curve 25519, ed 25519. Depending on your environment, you may want to have your security administrators have a look at the documentation over at zerotier.com. We'll be looking there in a minute. And they go into a lot more depth about how the security behind this works.
Just very quickly, Martin said security administrators there because your audio blipped a little bit, Martin.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I apologize for that. I too am on Virgin. I will be doing a live demo. However, my traffic will be minimal outside of the network. So hopefully I can get away with that. And if it does glitch, James will step in and I will go back over anything I've missed. So for accessing our estate when it's away, so we've all got a lot of home workers at the moment. Everybody's working from home. There are plenty of softwares out there we can use for that. There's TeamViewer, there's Bomgar. They all have their own unique issues, for want of a better word. Some are considered insecure, again, by our security admins. Some are quite expensive, and some are quite convoluted to set up or require interaction from our end users. There are new things in the Apple environment, such as PPPC, which I'm sure most of you are now familiar with, and things that we have to do to make that work. Inside our networks, we can use a tool like Apple Remote Desktop, SSH, VNC, and it all works a lot more streamlined. So wouldn't it be great, I was thinking, if we could do that wherever the devices are? Then zero tier came on my radar, and I realized we can do just that. So it sounds complicated to set up, and it really isn't. So it's demo time. For the demo, I will be turning off my camera because my demo is on another screen, and I don't want you all to think that I'm looking at your left ear. So I'm going to share another screen now, and I will turn off my camera until the end of the demo. So what we're looking at here is I'm logged into my account at zerotier.com. This does not have to be in their cloud. This is an open source piece of software that you can run on your own network if you don't want to run it in the cloud. The cloud version is free for up to 100 devices. The account is very quick to set up. Typical sign up. You put in your credentials, it verifies your email address, boom, you have an account and you've clicked on there. In order to get our client packages, we go to download at the top. And it's not just Mac, I should point out. It is Windows, Android, FreeBSD, plenty of other platforms it will work with. macOS is near the top. If we want our package to install, we just click on macOS package, and hopefully you see that has downloaded. Nice small deployable package. If I go back here, we're on the Networks tab at the moment. And you see I have a network created that I was using earlier. And it has a name, Trusting Mucci, I imagine that is. It will generate a random name for us, which we'll see now. So let's create a new network. It's created Insane Murray. I'm going to click on that network. And at the top, we can see we've got a network ID. Every network is given a unique ID. And that's what we'll provide to our clients so they can connect. And if we want to, we can change this name. It generates a unique name for us. You can modify that to something more descriptive for your network, and you can give it a description as well. For now, no need. I like Insane Murray rather. Access control, private or public. So private means when a member requests access to join, we have to authorize that either through this interface or using the API. A little bit more on that later. And a public node, if we set it as public, any node can become a member and we don't need to approve that. For the sake of this, I'm leaving it on private. I'm sure you might come up with scenarios where you want a public network. For this, we're looking at having a virtual network that is private. In the next section, we select what IP range we want for our network. So it has some built-in easy ones. We can go to advanced and specify anything we want. I suggest only using the advanced method if you really know what you're doing with it. What you want to select here is ideally going to be something that is not going to conflict with your internal network space. A lot of you will be using, I imagine, the 10 dot range internally, and ideally isn't going to conflict with home setups, because the reason I'm demoing this is for use with people working from home. Typically, home users are going to be on the 192.168.1 or .100 range. Most of these have been pretty well thought out. So for right now, let's go with 192.168.191, and we'll use that range. And you'll see when I connect that here, it also changed our managed routes, and we can specify our own managed routes as part of this network here as well. I'm now going to go down to members, and it shows that no devices have joined this network, which makes sense. And it says, use the 0 tier 1 app on your devices to join this number here, which is the same as that at the top. And I've just put that into my clipboard. So how do we join this network? Well, let's bring up a virtual machine. The package that I downloaded, I have already copied to the desktop here because live demos minimize the number of steps. This can obviously be pushed out with your Mac management systems, so Monkey, Jamf, whatever you're using. We'll run through the package and you'll see there's very little that we need to do with that. So it's just a question of continue. Do bear in mind this is a virtual machine, so resources are somewhat lighter than they would be in a desktop Mac. And install. It's going to prompt for admin authorization. And there we go. No need for a restart. It's installed and we are set to go. So it is installed and now we need to configure it. So there's two main ways of doing this. One of them is through a GUI and one of them is through command line. So let's start with the GUI. So I'm going to bring that up. Bear in mind, this does not need to be launched for your users. And we will be talking about automating this in a little while. So I've launched the 0 tier app, which was installed by the package. And when I click on that, I get the option to join network. Now, this does not need to be running for the 0 tier network need to be running. This is just a GUI method of looking at the service that runs out of a launch agent. I'm going to paste in my network ID and click on join. Now, if I pop over to our web portal, we now have a device listed. At the moment, it's not authorized. So it's listing here, it's not reporting any information, it's not authorized, but we can see its physical IP address. We can give it a name, so call that demo client, and I'm going to authorize it. And if we pop back to our client now, if I click on here and go to network details, we'll see it's connected and our status is okay. And you can see here we have joined the Insane Murray, I don't know why I keep saying a name, the Insane Murray network. Okay, let's set this up on my Mac now. So we have two clients in there because one client in a network isn't much use. So I'm just on a terminal window here. The CLI is 0tier -CLI. To join a network, we just use the keyword join and then our ID. I'll just authorize there. Join OK. And if I want to, again, from command line, see what's going on, I can just run list networks. And we can see the earlier trusting Mucci is okay and private, and I have an address for there. And this one is access denied at the moment. You may already have realized that's going to be because I haven't approved that device yet. So here's my admin Mac. And I'm just going to tick that box and authorize it. And that's going to bring my admin back online. And if I come back here and list my networks again, it's changed from access denied to OK. So that is setup done. It really is that straightforward. Will it work? Well, let's give that a try. So I'm going to, for now, I'm just going to take the IP that's been assigned to my other device, and let's put that into something that should look familiar to a lot of you, which is Apple Remote Desktop. I could scan the IP range, but I don't want to keep you waiting there while we scan. I'm just going to scan for that IP. And on that virtual IP, it has automatically picked that up when we scan for it as being a Mac. I'm going to go and authenticate against this. This is using just the VNC in sharing settings. Actually, let me just show that so I don't leave anybody behind. Hopefully you're familiar with this, but on my client Mac, if I go to sharing, you do need to have remote management enabled in order for this part of this to work. Hopefully many of you have used that already and familiar with what is necessary to set that up. Because we're using the VNC native stuff, it does mean that we don't have as much to worry about in terms of PPC. On older clients, we can use kickstart commands that you may be used to. And with modern MDM, certainly with Jamf on modern OSs, you can enable remote management from your MDM with a single button. So I'm just going to put in my credentials, add that device, and then I'm going to control it. And there we will see I am VNC'd into the desktop of my client, no matter where it is. It is very good, zero tier, very good at finding routes in order to enable connections. It starts out with using a high number UDP port outbound. It will use peer bouncing to find a appropriate path, and in almost all cases will find a path for your connection to run. There are no inbound ports to have to set up for that. Even if I were to enable the firewall on this Mac, the zero-tier network is still fine because it operates off an outbound port. So that's the demo. I'm just going to turn off that screen and hopefully start our presentation back. Hopefully James is still there. I am not currently able to
Yes,
start
I'll do
the
it for
presentation.
you.
Thank you.
Don't worry.
Still had a stop button.
There we go.
And thank you very much, James. So, automating. I've already mentioned that you can push out that package with any of Monkey, Jamf, any number of Mac management softwares. The configuration, as you saw, it's typically just a couple of command line things. So again, you can repackage that along with a post-install script to add the networks automatically. You can set those up as scripts within Jamf, and you can add the networks. Some of you may already be thinking, well, I could have multiple networks available. I could set up a policy in self-service, and I could have networks on demand. And indeed, you can do that, and that is something I've been playing with in-house. With the address that you have in there, bear in mind, with what we saw in the demo, I had to go to the website for this and look at the IP address on there, or go to the device. You can run a command to list the networks and see its IP address. Some of you may be ahead of me. You could use, for example, an extension attribute scripted in Jamf. So within your Jamf estate, you could see the IP addresses relating to each computer's zero-tier virtual network in there. The uses for zero-tier go way beyond what I've shown. Obviously, if your services are running on there, such as SSH, you can SSH to it instead of VNC. The uses for it are as far and wide as using private network. In essence, it is having a virtual private network, a VPN, without any
Martin,
complexity.
you said as far and wide as, and then turned into a robot. Do you want to just do that again?
Okay. The uses are far and wide. They're as far and wide as any remote connections using a VPN, without the complexity of having to set up a true VPN. And that comes to the end of my presentation. I'm going to ask James to bring his camera back on.
I've got to go back on camera now.
Yes, you do.
Hey, there we go.
Okay.
There we go. Thank you very much, Robot Martin. I think we got through that quite well without any internet problems, so it's quite good. You're either standing like a statue or frozen right now, but let's go for it.
I am standing like a statue.
So yeah, if anybody's got questions, please throw them in the chat. We can see there's a few in there at the moment. Bear in mind, there is a 10-second delay between us and you. The reason for that is there's a panic button. If anything goes wrong or one of us says something we shouldn't do, we can hit the stop button. So it may take us a while to get to your question if you type it in, so apologies for that. Right, so we've got a few in already. First one is, I'm going to ask this question. Yeah, I do. If all your locked down machines don't have user approved MDM enabled, is there any way to achieve this so that security settings can be pushed out to them for configuring no machine? Martin, do you want to take that one, or shall I take that one?
So I can take that one. I think I follow what you're asking. So user approved MDM is current since, I'm going to fail on which point version it came in on. But with later Mojave and Catalina, if you enroll a Mac device to MDM, somebody in front of the device has to click the user approve MDM button. That allows new MDM features such as kernel extension whitelisting, which is being phased out, and PPPCP. I'm not going to tell you what the acronym stands for. You can look that up. It's a bit of a tongue twister. the new security protocols are enabled by having UAMDM done. Note, if you're using the device enrollment program, you don't need to click on user approved because it's user approved by default. So sending out the security settings, it depends. You can't push down any scripts from just an MDM. Something like Jamf Pro allows you to push things down regardless of whether you've got UAMDM on, because it does that with its own framework. With just a pure MDM, you can... That's going to be an interesting question, James. The config files, they're not stored in a P list, are they? That's just pushed out to libraries.
No,
they are specific.
they're part of the package in resources etc. So it's just literally a config file that's in the package.
So we may need to take that question away and see if we can come up with a creative way of doing that. I'm sure that UAMDM should block that from being achieved. It's just how you would push out those settings remotely.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll tell you what, let's have a chat offline about that one. Jeremy, if you can just take a note of that question, we'll have a chat afterwards and we'll get back with a not completely off the cuff answer. Right, questions coming in thick and fast now. This is going to be fun, and everybody in here is quite technical by the looks of it, so that's going to be good. So next one, how do users authenticate if the server is in the DMZ without AD access? So I know that's relating to No Machine because I saw that come in when I was talking. So a couple of options. One is you could actually use zero tier to bridge between the No Machine cloud server and an Active Directory domain controller. Depends entirely on your security posture as to whether you're comfortable doing that, though. In actual fact, in that demo that I showed you earlier with No Machine, all three of those devices were connected via zero tier. I can't remember if I said that or not, but all of them were connected via zero tier. So that's one option. The other option is, as I said at the start, only the user account names need to be the same. So what you could do, and this is a bit of a fiddly way of doing it, but it's possible, is export a list of users from Active Directory and import them into No Machine Cloud Server as local accounts. So you can create No Machine local accounts on the cloud server. You would then have to generate a password and distribute the passwords to the users, though. It's not great, but on the basis that you need to have authentication on that system anyway. So whether it's directory access or not directory access, you're going to have to generate user accounts, unfortunately. They just need to be the same username schema as Active Directory and all will be fine. The only difference will be the password the user uses to authenticate with to No Machine Cloud Server. If it's different, if they set it to a different thing to their AD password, they'll get a gate at the desktop. They'll get the normal user login authentication window as opposed to just going straight through. It will already have populated the username. They'll just have to put their directory password in. So hopefully that answers that question. I know there's not a particularly slick thing, but you have to have users to be able to authenticate via cloud server. Otherwise, problem. The other option you could potentially do by smashing these two solutions together is if you had No Machine Cloud Server sitting inside your network, i.e. in the same VLAN as the client machines and not in the DMZ, and all of your users are on zero tier and the cloud server is on zero tier, then everything will just work. So while Martin was talking for the use case of being able to access your Macs to administer them wherever they are, you can actually use it the other way around and effectively use it like a VPN, but just for No Machine Cloud Server. So that's a potential option as well. It just depends on your network topology. So happy to talk to you separately about that. But if you're happy to do a bit of fiddling around with user accounts, it might be export import is the best way to do it. Otherwise, if you're happy to use zero tier, that's probably cleaner. Then you just put cloud server in a part of the network that can see your domain. So that is that. So question, I mean, I can answer this one. Martin, does zero tier support audio? It's a really straightforward answer. Zero tier is a network, so you can think about it in exactly the same way as a LAN. You can even do, Martin didn't show this, but you can do quite complex flow rules as well if you want to get really into the nerdy network stuff there. But it basically does everything a normal network does. It is just a stretched network connection. I don't know, Martin,
this may actually tie into a question that's coming up around latencies, which I think is the next one. But perhaps you were asking whether the latency was good enough for audio. It adds very, very little network overhead, almost indistinguishable from it not being there as a layer. Bear in mind, you're not having to send your connection through the online aggregator. It is negotiating a peer-to-peer connection. So you are talking directly to the device.
Yeah. I'm not sure if the live user latency thing was a No Machine question, but the question just after it, actually, which is kind of saying what is audio like with No Machine? Would it be possible to do a quick demo, say play a short bit from a YouTube on the Mac so we can see? It would, not right now, because I haven't got that environment set up. I did that a few days ago, but if you guys are interested, actually I can do a like a live session, with the caveat that it may all go horribly wrong, but I can put together a live session and we can do some testing. If you've got some stuff you want to throw at me to say, does this work, doesn't this work, then we can more than happy put that together. But from a general point of view, there is very little latency when you're playing back audio with video on the remote machine. And that's because the NX protocol has an audio video sync feature built into it. In terms of latency from when I hit the spacebar on my client machine to when stuff starts playing on the remote machine, there are so many variables in there, like the user's home connection, internet weather that sits in the middle, routes, BGP, your quality of service sitting on your network, all of that kind of stuff. So it really, really, really does vary based on your own environment. But if it's set up correctly, then there's a bit of lag, but it's not ridiculous. We have had people before use remote USB from a client device to a No Machine target endpoint device and record audio. It's not something you'd want to do to a remote click track, but you can actually send audio via USB all the way down the wire to the target device if you want to. I personally wouldn't do it just because variables again. But it is entirely possible to do so. I hope that answers those questions, guys. If it doesn't, please chuck another question in and we'll attempt to do that a bit better. What is the cost for No Machine Enterprise? So it's licensed in a couple of different ways. So Enterprise Desktop can be bought as either single licenses or in packs of 10. And No Machine Cloud Server is licensed by the number of cores that you need for the cloud server that you're using. So there is a sizing guide. There is, again, a bit of your mileage may vary there, but there is a sort of a general theme of how many cores you need. I'm not a sales guy, so I can't give you pricing off the bat, but I believe we do have a couple of the academia account managers in chat. So if you could make yourselves known and just chuck your email addresses in, then we can get some pricing out to everybody and get an idea of it. It's not ridiculous money though. It's certainly not ridiculous money. Question, iLok on physical license. Can license be recognized via this system? If you're talking about No Machine, then yes, because you can send remote USB and it appears as a local USB device on the remote machine. The auth for it, that initial startup process may take a little bit longer because it's sending the iLok data across the wire, but it behaves and it's seen as a USB device. So I think there's a couple of questions that are the same on there as well. Sorry, Martin, there's a lot of No Machine stuff going on at the moment.
That's quite all right. If you were talking about zero tier, because it's essentially the computer is going to see that as a LAN. So if you're talking about iLok network licensing, then yes, it will also see that as long as it's on the same zero-tier network.
Okay, so how much is No Machine Enterprise? Okay, so we've already answered that one. Live user latency answered that one. Is that it is Jamf clients I'm talking about, UAMDM, Martin. So clarification from earlier when we're talking about UAMDM.
Okay, so yes, you can use policies to push down the software and push down config without having to have UAMDM. UAMDM is only necessary to have been clicked on in order for things like PPPC to run, or to override, I should say.
Okay, all good. It looks like No Machine would now allow us to manage access to machines then, as in set access restrictions around timetabling, for example. So users could only access devices when they're timetabled to. No, so unfortunately, that's one thing No Machine can't do, is while it can set timeouts for inactivity, it can't say this specific user or this group of users can only access these machines during these time periods. That's one thing it can't do. There is, and you're probably not going to like this, there is an admin kick-out function, so you can kick out people who aren't supposed to be on the machines. I think there's something in the roadmap about that. But it's not part of core functionality to have timetabling as part of the core functionality, I'm afraid. Question for We Use Citrix. I don't know which side of it this is from, but from a No Machine perspective, the protocol is completely different. It should, in theory, work side by side. It should, in theory, even work side by side if you have a Citrix user and a No Machine user connecting at the same time, but that also may present a problem. Because they're different protocols, they'll use different ports. There's no reason theoretically why both of those couldn't coexist, but you may get clashes with two users trying to sign on simultaneously via each system. Martin, from a No Machine, a zero-tier perspective, I don't think there's a Citrix problem, is there?
I cannot think of anything that would conflict. However, it has been some time since I've done a XenApp admin course, so...
Yeah. I mean, the theory being...
I can't think of anything that would conflict. You're running just a separate network range on the devices.
Yeah, zero-tier doesn't block anything unless you tell it to. There's no protocols or ports or anything that are disallowed. Latency is pretty low, as we've said. It's I don't.
You could absolutely configure it to break stuff if you wanted to, but out of the box, no, not as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, if anybody's really interested, we can throw the flow rules screen up as a remote screen share if you really want to see it. So let us know. Citrix one, is it as fast as Dante? So that, I believe, is a zero-tier question. But Martin, are you going to ask what Dante is?
I am not familiar with Dante. So pass.
So again, the general thing with zero-tier is think of it as literally it's like plugging in physical cables with very, 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 very little latency addition. So it doesn't have any additional encoder or decoder protocols on it. It doesn't have anything as part of it that isn't basically a network driver. So when you're talking about is it as fast as other systems, it's as fast as a system that sits on a network can possibly be. And that's a really, really wishy-washy answer. But in theory, it should actually be a bit quicker. So go on.
That because of the way it facilitates the connections peer-to-peer, if there's nothing it's having to get to work around in order to facilitate that connection. So if UDP outbound is blocked and it's having to create a route to that device, it is possible to slow down the connection that way. In a normal scenario, it doesn't add any latency because a normal scenario is point-to-point traffic. It is designed to work around network issues, network problems. So if it is working around a network problem, then you could add in latency there.
Yeah, okay, fair point. Okay, so in terms of editing audio video, has it been tested with mouse lag latency for accuracy? So I'm going to assume that's a No Machine thing. Again, I should have said at the start, please let us know which product you're asking questions about when you're asking questions. I don't know if Martin's doing his statue impression again or whether he's frozen or completely disappeared. So we'll hang on for a second there.
I will move a little.
No, we've got had a really unflattering freeze frame of you for a second there. That was great.
Excellent. Good to know.
Yeah, has it been tested with mouse lag latency for accuracy? So it is indistinguishable. No Machine is indistinguishable in reality from when you're on a local network using it. When you're on a WAN, again, I go back to the variable point where it depends entirely on what's between that end user and your machines from a networking perspective. But from a personal point of view, I've been using No Machine for quite a while now, and it is the least laggy system I have ever used personally. So this is a asterisk person opinion, not necessarily the opinion of Academia Group or any of the associated subsidiaries. But it is made and it is optimized for things like audio video use and low latency, low lag. So I've actually edited video off of it remotely from my house, and it's been absolutely fine. I was previously a video editor back in the day, so I'm quite sensitive to that stuff. But huge caveat, everybody's remote at the moment. When users are at home, you don't have control over what's going on. What we're talking about here is making something the best it can possibly be and giving the user the best possible chance to remotely access that system and use it in the best way they possibly can. So that's as far as I can say. Will iLock allow this as part of the license? Now, that is a really interesting one. I'm assuming that was related to the question earlier about using a remote iLock. I'm not going to speak on behalf of Avid, but in theory, you are using a physical iLock to access or to allow access to a single copy of Pro Tools, right? So as far as I'm aware of the Avid EULA, that's one thing I haven't read. I'm afraid with Apple's, but not necessarily Avid's, is that the reason it's in place is to allow a one user to one application interaction. And that's exactly what you're doing when you're using it remotely with USB OIP. You are not physically at the machine, but you're still using the USB protocol and you're still using the iLock in the way in which it was intended. So I would think that's the case, but like I'm not going to say that's a definitive answer at this point, I'm afraid. I would get killed by our legal team for that. So a no machine setup webinar will be very useful. Okay, so I'll have a chat to our marketing team and see what we can set up. That will be a lot more casual than this, because what you will see is me breaking stuff and completely messing things up and having to Google things. But I've done quite a few no machine setups, but we can do a build, and we can do a collaborative one if you like, where people can get involved as well. So we'll have a look at that. Pace, I'm guessing that relates to the iLock question. Same answer applies. Martin, this is one for you. This is interesting. A delayed conversation with a 10-second delay in the midst of a bunch of questions, but no machine requires a KEXT approval. That does need UAMDM.
Okay, so no machine does. John was talking about pushing out a config for it. So yes. So you're talking about trying to remotely push out no machine to clients without having to attend the device, without UAMDM. Any way to get around that for the install? Not that immediately springs to mind. Again, if we can make a note of that, I will come back to you, Peter, and see if I can come up with a solution to exactly what you're asking.
Cool. Okay, is there a minimum speed required by our students to use from home? So I'm assuming that's a no machine question. We can probably answer it on behalf of both anyway. So 5 meg is the minimum requirement, but for a good experience, I'd say you probably want 10, 15 plus. The way to think about it is it is a streaming protocol, right? So in theory, if a student can stream HD YouTube to their house, then they'll be okay with no machine. Obviously, upstream, downstream, different thing. Ratios are different, but 5 meg is a minimum to have it functional for a good experience. I'd suggest you're talking 10 to 15 as an absolute minimum. And then again, that's assuming there's nobody else in the house, downloading stuff, uploading stuff, accessing, etc. But it is really worth a bit of a test. And I know every time someone asks me about requirements for this, I'm being really vague, but it is so dependent on the network. But we are sort of using an app that gives you the best possible experience. And from a zero-tier perspective, that just needs visibility of the internet, right? Doesn't really care about particular speeds, Martin, I don't think.
Sorry, I was glitching a bit on my internet at that moment, so I didn't catch all of what you were asking me at the end. But in general, yeah, I agree with what you said.
That's absolutely amazing. Thank you for that. So that one says great, awesome. Sorry, can you clarify? Do you just need to use zero-tier? Do you just need to use zero-tier to use Apple Remote Desktop to manage clients externally and still manage clients on-prem?
So yes, in the demo I showed, zero-tier I was using so that we could access the Apple Remote Desktop ports, which is essentially the VNC ports. So the reason we're doing that is we don't want to have to open up those ports remotely and then need to know where those devices are. Even if we were using something like Jamf, where we'd only get IP information when it's doing its inventory update. So it enables us to have essentially an always-on virtual network. And anything that we have enabled to access within that virtual network, we can access. So we can use products like Apple Remote Desktop. I was showing this because everybody's working from home and you may have Macs out there that you need to remote onto to help, and you haven't pre-provisioned something like Bomgar or something else, or there's software you're not allowed to use. So this enables, just by provisioning that, for you to use a product like Apple Remote Desktop in order to manage those Macs. Hope that clarifies.
Okay, Cool. So, and just to clarify on that as well, there's no requirement to use No Machine to do that stuff. It's just 0-tier. So it is a stretched network. Would No Machine work with Avid multi-seat network licenses? So the way to think of No Machine is basically it is the same as if a user is sitting at the desktop machine from a licensing perspective. Again, caveat, I haven't read every single EULA for every single piece of software, but from a theory perspective, it is basically giving that user a physical seat, albeit a remote one, a physical seat at that desktop machine. So your current licenses should apply because the software is running on the machine that is sitting in your estate, which is the same machine that a student would be using if they were sitting at it, if that makes sense. So that shouldn't make any difference with the licensing. It only tends to get a bit funky with licensing and remote use when you're in like a terminal services environment. The software vendors in general don't tend to like you having one single compute resource and lots of users using that resource, because you can do like license avoidance and things like that. So the concerns around that are generally where there's a multi-user single resource environment. This is a single user single resource environment, so it shouldn't affect any ULAs. But I'd always say double check, because I am not a lawyer. So as much as people keep asking me legal questions all the time, aside from this webinar. So I think that is it from a question perspective. That was quite a good run. I think it was about half an hour of Q&A. So unless there's any last couple of stragglers, you need to speak now or forever hold your peace. We'll wait a few seconds just in case there is, because of the delay. We will be hanging around for a few minutes in chat. I'm going to put the outro plate on that will play the same music at the start. And Martin and I will hang around in the chat. Please feel free to say hello to us or ask any other questions you didn't get to ask right now, and we'll do our best to answer. So I think that's all good. Thank you very much for attending, everyone. Much appreciated, and feel free to follow up with us afterwards. Feel free to talk to your account manager. They can get you on a call with us about the respective pieces of software and anything else you may need. So thank you very much.